Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to peel back the layers of film history's most fascinating legend to uncover the truth actually hiding in the archives. You know, when you hear the name Stanley Kubrick, a very specific image almost certainly comes to mind, right? The isolated genius, the meticulous visionary, the obsessive auteur who demanded nothing short of absolute perfection. Well, today, we're going to look right past that polished legacy and examine the actual material conditions that created it.
So for decades, the narrative surrounding Kubrick was that he was the ultimate suffering artist. A maverick fighting the corporate Hollywood machine tooth and nail to maintain his creative independence. This myth of the reclusive dictator on set has been taken as absolute gospel. But what if that public persona was, in itself, a carefully crafted production? What if cinema's greatest myth was actually directed by the master himself?
Now, to really understand the power of this myth, we absolutely have to acknowledge his undeniable cinematic genius. I mean, his work was praised by legendary peers like Orson Welles, who called him a giant in a 1964 interview. Kubrick directed 13 feature films in his life, and his influence literally spans across multiple areas of filmmaking. And the reason this myth holds so much water is because his art truly is extraordinary. He demanded a completely unique level of control over every single aspect of production, from the deep historical research of his settings to the incredibly precise lighting of every single frame.
He was always pushing technical boundaries. We're talking practical effects, unique lenses, and fluid camera movements that permanently changed cinema. For example, he used lenses originally developed for NASA just so he could film the 18th century period drama Barry Lyndon using nothing but natural candlelight. He developed slit-scan photography to create the mind-bending Stargate sequence in 2001: A Space Odyssey, way before modern CGI was a thing. And he worked hand-in-hand with Steadicam operator Garrett Brown on The Shining to capture those unbelievably smooth, ghostly, low-angle tracking shots. The technical brilliance? That is absolutely real.
But here is where things get really interesting. When we pivot to the archival documents, they reveal that his suffering artist persona wasn't just a quirky byproduct of his personality. It was actually a highly calculated brand strategy. This image was explicitly created by his own company, Polaris Productions, designed to consolidate his power at a time when independent producers were battling Hollywood studios for control. The whole auteur image wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate promotional strategy instigated by his publicists. He controlled his interviews with an iron fist, sometimes even making annotated corrections directly to print journalist copy before it was published.
So how do we know all this? Well, thanks to extensive empirical research from the Stanley Kubrick archive, which was brought to light by academics at Sheffield Hallam University, we can actually open up his filing cabinets and just let the historical data speak for itself. We're talking about an archive containing over 1,000 boxes and hundreds of thousands of documents, contracts, budgets, faxes, casting notes, the whole shebang. By looking at these daily administrative realities, researchers are moving past just analyzing his films and actually understanding the true relations of production. How did he genuinely work with people behind the scenes?
Let's dive into Section 1, Behind the Casting Call for a Clockwork Orange.
To see his professional behaviors in action, especially regarding gender, we just have to look at his casting notes from August 1970. The stark contrast here is pretty revealing. While male actors were being judged on their intellect and delivery, getting notes like intelligent, rugged, or good voice, women were often reduced to a heavily objectified shorthand code. Kubrick used acronyms like VGF for very good figure, or VGL for very good legs. The archival notes show us clearly that he was evaluating female actors primarily on their bodies, regardless of whether the role actually required it, while male actors were evaluated for their professional performing abilities.
Take this specific note on an actress auditioning for a highly sensitive role in A Clockwork Orange. This shows the troubling reality of his casting preference taking priority over actual acting ability. These exact notes were written next to the name of Cheryl Grunwald. Now, she was ultimately cast in the incredibly controversial and delicate role of the rape victim of Billy Boy's gang. But instead of approaching the casting of such a sensitive scene with professional delicacy, the notes completely dismiss her acting ability as merely fair and focus entirely on derogatory, objectifying physical descriptions. It's a really sobering look at the actual power dynamics at play during his casting sessions.
Let's move on to Section 2, Labor, Power, and the Pursuit of Perfection.
The standard myth tells us that his extreme demands were totally justified because he was in pursuit of high art. The suffering artist narrative often excused his behavior, even when he was berating his crew for taking union-mandated tea breaks. And this wasn't just on a normal soundstage. This quote is from behind-the-scenes footage on the set of Full Metal Jacket. They were filming at Beckton Gasworks in London, which actor Matthew Modine later described as an incredibly toxic site. The crew was literally breathing in asbestos dust all day long, to the point where their bathwater would turn blue at night. Yet Kubrick is caught on camera aggressively ridiculing his crew just for taking legally mandated breaks in this highly hazardous environment.
And this wasn't an isolated incident. A 1966 letter reveals his active frustration over labor regulations, where he actually blamed union breaks for inflating the budget of 2001: A Space Odyssey. Writing directly to the president of MGM, Kubrick tried to explain why the film was hundreds of thousands of dollars over budget. But instead of taking managerial responsibility, he pointed the finger straight at trade union rules about daily working hours and tea breaks. He explicitly viewed these workers' rights as massive barriers to his own extreme work patterns. We even know from the memoirs of his assistants that he actively encouraged his staff to remain non-unionized, just so they wouldn't be bound by the standard English work week.
Finally, let's explore Section 3, Wealth, Taxes, and Political Influence.
So, how did Kubrick use his manufactured power and influence completely offset to protect his personal assets? Well, in 1974, the UK Labour Party government proposed an annual wealth tax aimed at the richest individuals to help fund social programs. This could have levied up to an 83% tax rate on top earners. Kubrick, who had been living comfortably in the UK for years, privately joined forces with other highly powerful Hollywood figures, like Roman Polanski and Norman Jewison. Together, they quietly but aggressively lobbied the absolute highest levels of the British political establishment, strictly demanding exemptions for film directors and producers.
To put his leverage into perspective, he explicitly used his cinematic prestige, reminding politicians of the $27 million in production spending he had personally brought to the UK. He used the very real threat of capital flight to protect his interests. In a letter to an influential British television executive, which was passed directly to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kubrick threatened to leave England entirely if the tax laws weren't amended to his liking. And you know what? The government, fearing this massive loss of foreign capital from Kubrick and his wealthy peers, ultimately dropped the policy. The archive shows us a man who is acutely aware of his structural power in society, and he was perfectly willing to use it. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final provocative question. How do we balance the undeniable brilliance of the art with the manufactured, newly uncovered reality of the artist? There's no denying that Stanley Kubrick changed the medium of film forever. His visuals are absolutely iconic. His technical innovations made history. But the archives teach us that the myth of the eccentric, suffering genius was, at least in part, a shield. It was a carefully directed brand strategy that obscured some deeply troubling labor practices, objectifying casting methods, and immense political privilege. Understanding all this doesn't erase his art, for sure, but it does ground the artist in reality. It proves that the most complex, highly orchestrated narrative Stanley Kubrick ever directed might just have been his own legacy.